At my husband's funeral, the lawyer announced that the mistress would inherit everything. My son hugged her and called her mom. I just smiled and pulled out the real will. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The scent of gardenias and old money was a suffocating, cloying thing in the humid savannah air. From my seat in the front pew of the historic First African Baptist Church, Lena Harrison watched the theater of my husband's funeral unfold. It was a grand production, of course. Franklin had never done anything on a small scale. The church was overflowing with the city's elite, politicians, old family matriarchs, and the new money developers who had both feared and admired him. They had come to pay their respects to the king. I, his queen of 42 years, was now the quiet, dignified widow, a role I was expected to play with grace and a suitable amount of sorrow. My sorrow was real, but it was a complicated, layered thing, a geological formation of love, grief, and a cold, quiet anger that had been simmering for the past 5 years. I watched my son Marcus, our only child, sitting beside me. At 42, he was a handsome man, a polished corporate version of his father's rugged charm, but his grief felt performative. His face was a mask of somber respectability, but his eyes were restless, his foot tapping in impatient rhythm against the heart-pine floorboards. He was not mourning a father. He was waiting for the curtain to fall on the final act so he could get to the reading of the will. And next to him, in the seat that should have been reserved for a grieving daughter, sat Isabelle Rousseau. She was 39, beautiful and dressed in a black dress so exquisitely tailored, it was an act of fashionable defiance at a funeral. To the world, she was my husband's indispensable executive assistant. To me, she was the cancer that had metastasized in the final years of my marriage. She dabbed at her dry, beautiful eyes with a black lace handkerchief, her shoulders occasionally shuddering with a delicate, well-rehearsed sob. She was playing the part of the devoted, heartbroken protégé, a woman who had lost not just a boss but a mentor, a father figure. It was a magnificent performance, and my own son was her captive audience. I watched as he placed a comforting hand on her arm, his expression one of deep shared grief, a united front. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. This was not just a funeral, it was a coronation, and I was the Dowager Queen, being politely but firmly ushered into the shadows. I looked at the grand mahogany casket at the front of the church, and I whispered to my late husband in the silence of my own heart, "You foolish, foolish man, look at the mess you've left me to clean up." Franklin and I had been a team. In the beginning, in the lean, hungry years of the late 1970s, we were an unstoppable force. He was the charisma, the vision, the salesman who could charm a city council into granting a zoning variance with a single dazzling smile. I was the engine, the quiet, strategic mind behind the curtain. I was a history professor back then, specializing in the architectural and cultural history of the Low Country. It was my research, my deep academic understanding of Savannah's hidden corners, that had been the foundation of our empire. I was the one who found the crumbling, forgotten warehouses on the riverfront, the ones no one else wanted, and saw in them the potential for luxury lofts. I was the one who pored over dusty archival maps, identifying the Gola Geechee heritage sites that, with careful, respectful restoration, could become award-winning historical inns. I remember the nights we would spend at our small kitchen table, spread with blueprints and historical surveys, our minds buzzing with a shared electric excitement. He was the builder, I was the historian. Together we had breathed new life into the forgotten bones of this city. We had built an empire. But as the empire grew, Franklin changed. The success, the money, the constant fawning attention of the city's powerful, it had all acted like a slow, corrosive poison on his character. The humble, hard-working man I had married was gradually replaced by a larger-than-life figure, a magnate who began to believe his own legend, and in his new narrative, there was less and less room for a quiet, academic partner. He began to dismiss my contributions. My research became a little hobby. My strategic insights were good instincts. For a woman, he stopped bringing the blueprints home. The conversations at the kitchen table were replaced by long, important dinners at the country club. Dinners to which I was invited, but at which I was expected to be a silent, smiling accessory. The final definitive blow had come 5 years ago, with the arrival of Isabelle Rousseau. She had been a junior marketing associate at his company, a young, beautiful and deeply ambitious woman who had immediately recognized the rot in the heart of our marriage. She had seen Franklin's immense and deeply fragile ego, and she had fed it with a brilliant, relentless campaign of adoration. She had listened to his stories with wide-eyed wonder. She had praised his vision, his genius. She had made him feel like the king he so desperately wanted to be, and he, in his vanity and his late-life crisis, had devoured it. I, with my quiet truths and my refusal to flatter his ego, could not compete. I had become the boring, sensible, and slightly critical wife. She was the exciting, adoring, and deeply appreciative partner. The silent partner in my own life had been replaced. The most painful part of Franklin's slow moral drift was not the affair itself. It was the effect it had on my son. Marcus had spent his entire life worshipping his father, and being terrified of him. He was a boy who had grown up in the long, formidable shadow of a great oak tree, and he had never been able to find enough sunlight to grow into his own man. His resentment towards me was a quiet, lifelong thing, a low-grade fever that had spiked in the last few years. He saw me not as his mother but as his father's critic. He interpreted my quiet academic nature as a lack of ambition, my refusal to play the part of the fawning socialite as a source of family embarrassment. He, like his father, had come to see my strength as a form of weakness. Isabel, with her sharp, predatory instincts, had seen this weakness in him, and she had exploited it masterfully. She had not just seduced the father, she had adopted the son. She had become Marcus's confidant, his ally, his champion within the company. She had praised his ideas to his father, ideas she had often subtly manipulated him into having in the first place. She had created a powerful triangular alliance with Franklin at the top, and herself and Marcus as his loyal modernizing lieutenants, united against the old, traditional, and in their eyes, obsolete Queen Me. I remember one Sunday dinner, about a year before Franklin's death. I had questioned a risky new development project Franklin was considering. A high-rise condo building that I believed was financially over-leveraged and architecturally out of character with the historic district. My analysis was sound, my points logical. Before Franklin could even respond, Marcus had jumped in. "Mom, with all due respect," he had said, his voice dripping with a condescending impatience. "You don't understand the market anymore. This isn't about historical preservation. It's about growth. It's about the future. Isabel gets that. She has her finger on the pulse of the new Savannah." Isabel, who was seated at the table, had given me a small, pitying smile. "It's a different world now, Lena," she had said, her voice a soft, silken thing. "Franklin is a visionary. You have to be willing to take risks to build an empire." I had looked at my son, so eagerly and so blindly defending the woman who was sleeping with his father, so casually dismissing his own mother's 4 decades of experience, and my heart had broken. They were a team, and I was the opposition. He had chosen his side, and in doing so he had left me utterly, completely, and finally alone in my own family. The reception after the funeral was a crowded, murmuring affair at our large, beautiful home on Forsyth Park, a house that no longer felt like my own. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting condolences from people whose faces I barely recognized, my own grief a private, walled-off garden in the midst of this public performance of sorrow. I saw Marcus and Isabel standing together in a corner, a small, powerful court of 2, accepting sympathies as if they were the bereaved couple. He had his arm around her. She was leaning her head on his shoulder. The sight of it, the sheer brazen audacity of it, was a fresh, sharp stab to my heart. I slipped away, seeking a moment of quiet in Franklin's old study, a room that smelled of his cigars and his ambition. I was standing by the window, looking out at the ancient, moss-draped oaks of the park, when a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "Lena?" It was Elias Cole, our lawyer. My friend. He was a tall, elegant, and deeply kind man in his 70s. One of the last true gentlemen of the old Savannah legal world. He had been my friend since we were students together at Howard University, long before Franklin, long before the money. He knew the whole story. He came into the room and stood beside me, his presence a quiet, solid comfort. "Are you ready for this, Lena?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle murmur. "For tomorrow? I am as ready as I will ever be, Elias," I replied, my own voice a weary whisper. Franklin's final wishes were complicated, he said, and his voice was laced with a deep professional disapproval. He had been Franklin's lawyer, but he had been my friend, and I knew that his loyalty in the end was to me and to the memory of the good man Franklin had once been. "He was a complicated man," I said, a sad, humorless smile touching my lips. "It only follows that his will would be the same." He looked at me, his old wise eyes full of a deep, sorrowful sympathy. He knew about the affair. He knew about Marcus. He knew the full ugly truth of the past 5 years. And he knew about the final secret meeting he and I and a very repentant Franklin had had, just 1 month before his death. He was a fool. Lena, Elias said quietly, his voice full of a gentle anger. A proud, arrogant fool. But he loved you. In his own broken way he never stopped loving you. And he knew, in the end, that he had made a terrible, terrible mess of things. He did. I agreed, my gaze still fixed on the old eternal oaks outside. And now I have to be the one to clean it up. We will clean it up together, he said, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of old deep and unwavering friendship. I have my instructions. The stage is set. You just have to be strong enough to play your part. Oh, I'll be strong enough, I said, my voice no longer a whisper, but a thing of quiet, cold and unshakable resolve. I am ready to see his final accounts settled, Elias. All of them. The offices of Cole, Thorne and Associates were a bastion of old Savannah, a quiet wood-paneled world that felt a century removed from the bustling city outside. The air smelled of old paper, lemon polish and the quiet, dignified weight of other people's money. It was the perfect stage for the final act of my husband's life. I arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, dressed in a simple, elegant gray suit, my posture erect, my expression serene. I was the picture of a grieving but composed widow. A woman of quiet strength and unshakable dignity. It was a performance, of course, but it was a role I had been perfecting for years. Marcus and Isabel were already there, seated in the 2 large leather armchairs in front of Elias's massive antique desk. They were a perfect somber pair. He in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his face a mask of filial grief. She in a simple but devastatingly expensive black dress, her face a beautiful tragic mask of sorrow. They looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting to one of polite, pitying concern. They saw not a rival but a relic, a frail old woman who was about to be gently but firmly pushed aside by the new modern forces of the future. Lena, Isabel said, her voice a soft, sympathetic purr as she rose to give me a kiss on the cheek. Her perfume was a cloud of expensive funeral lilies. How are you holding up? I am as well as can be expected, Isabel, I replied, my own voice a quiet, neutral thing. I did not return her embrace. I simply took the remaining armchair, positioning it slightly apart from them, a subtle but clear signal of our disunion. The air in the room was thick with a tense, expectant silence. Marcus was trying and failing to look sad. His knee was bouncing with a frantic, impatient energy. Isabel was the picture of calm, but her hands, I noted, were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. They were vultures waiting for the feast to be served. Elias entered from his private antechamber, a thick, sealed, cream-colored envelope in his hand. He looked at us, his expression one of solemn professional gravity. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice the deep, formal baritone of a man about to perform a sacred rite. We are here to read the last will and testament of my client, and my friend Franklin Harrison. He sat down behind his desk, placed the envelope before him and broke the wax seal with a small silver letter opener. The soft tearing sound was the only noise in the dead silent room. He took out a thick sheaf of papers, put on his reading glasses, and cleared his throat. The stage was set, the audience was captive, and the first fraudulent and deeply cruel act of my husband's final play was about to begin. Elias began to read. His voice a steady, dispassionate monotone that gave no hint of the bombshells that were about to be dropped. He started with the usual dry legal boilerplate, the declaration of sound mind, the revocation of all previous wills, the appointment of himself as executor. Marcus and Isabel listened, their feigned sorrow already beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a naked, impatient greed. Then, Elias moved to the bequests. To my various cousins, nieces and nephews, he read, I leave the sum of $25,000 each as a token of my affection. A small, almost imperceptible scoff escaped Isabel's lips. To her a sum like that was a rounding error. An insultingly small gesture from a man of Franklin's immense wealth. To my loyal employees at the Harrison Development Group, Elias continued, I bequeath a bonus equivalent to 1 year's salary, as a recognition of their years of dedicated service. This was a genuine surprise, and a small warm flicker of the man I had once loved. The generous, good-hearted man shone through, but it was a fleeting warmth. The cold, ugly heart of the document was yet to be revealed. Elias paused. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water. He looked up over the rim of his glasses, first at Marcus, then at Isabel, and then with a look of profound, almost apologetic sympathy at me. And now, he said, his voice dropping a full octave, to the disposition of the remainder of my estate. He began to read again, and with every word the foundation of my 42-year marriage of my entire life was systematically and very publicly demolished. To my wife, Lena Harrison, he read, I leave her personal effects, her collection of books and art, and a lifetime stipend of $100,000 per year, to ensure her continued comfort and well-being. I thank her for her years of companionship. Companionship. Not love. Not partnership. Companionship. The word was a cold, clinical, and deeply insulting dismissal of our entire life together. The stipend, a fortune to most, was, in the context of his 9-figure estate, a pittance, a tip, a gesture of polite parting noblesse oblige. I felt a wave of dizzying, disorienting shock, even though I knew this was coming. To hear it read aloud in the cold, formal language of the law was a fresh, sharp wound. I kept my face a mask of serene, impassive calm. I did not flinch. And then came the final brutal and utterly devastating blow. All the rest of my estate, Elias read, his voice now a low, solemn thing, including all shares and controlling interest in the Harrison Development Group, all real estate holdings, all investment portfolios, and my primary residence at 1 Forsyth Park, I leave in its entirety to my true partner, my inspiration, and the great love of my later years, Ms. Isabel Rousseau. The room was stunned into a profound, almost violent silence. The air itself seemed to have been sucked from the room. I could hear the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart. I looked at Isabel. Her face, which had been a mask of performative sorrow, was now a blossoming flower of pure, unadulterated, and deeply triumphant joy. A single, perfect, and completely fraudulent tear traced a path down her beautiful cheek. She had done it. She had won. The mistress had, at last, become the queen. The silence in Elias's office was a living, breathing thing. It was thick with the ghosts of 42 years of marriage, with the raw, shocking power of a public and posthumous betrayal. Franklin's extended family, his 2 sisters and their husbands who were also present, were in a state of open-mouthed, slack-jawed disbelief. They were looking from me to Isabel, and then back again, their faces a mixture of pity and a delicious, scandalized horror. Lena Harrison, the respected professor, the dignified matriarch, had just been publicly and legally cast aside in favor of the younger, more beautiful assistant. It was a story as old as time, a tawdry, cliché-ridden drama that was now playing out in the most humiliating way imaginable. Isabel, for her part, was giving an Academy Award-worthy performance. She had brought her hands up to her face, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be overwhelming grateful sobs. She was the picture of a woman who had been unexpectedly and profoundly honored, a woman humbled by the great love of a great man. It was a masterpiece of deceit. But the most devastating performance was yet to come, and it would be delivered by my son, Marcus, who had been frozen in his chair, his face a mask of stunned, disbelieving joy, finally seemed to come to his senses. He looked from the weeping, triumphant Isabel to my own still, silent form, and in his eyes, I saw not a flicker of sympathy, not a shred of loyalty to the mother who had raised him. All I saw was a look of pure, unadulterated, and deeply satisfying validation. He had been right all along. His father had chosen the modern, ambitious woman over the old, traditional one. He had chosen the future over the past. He had chosen them over me. And then, he stood up. He did not walk over to me. He did not place a comforting hand on my shoulder. He did not offer a single solitary word of support to the mother who had just been publicly humiliated and effectively disinherited. Instead, he walked over to Isabel. He knelt down before her chair, before the new queen, the new matriarch of his family. He wrapped his arms around her shaking shoulders in a gesture of profound and deeply public comfort and solidarity. And then, in a voice that was clear, strong, and loud enough for everyone in that silent, shocked room to hear, he delivered the final, killing blow. The ultimate act of maternal betrayal. "It's okay, Mom," he said, his voice thick with a convincing counterfeit emotion. He was not speaking to me, he was speaking to her. He was calling his father's mistress Mom. He did the right thing. It's what you both deserved. The room, which had been silent, now erupted in a series of shocked, scandalized gasps. My husband's sisters were staring at their nephew as if he had just grown a second head. He had not just accepted the new world order, he had embraced it. He had endorsed it. He had, in a single, terrible and unforgivable act, publicly and willingly replaced his own mother. He had chosen his side, And in doing so he had in my heart ceased to be my son. The chaos in the room was a distant roaring sea. Franklin's sisters were now on their feet, their voices a shrill chorus of outrage. "Marcus, have you lost your mind?" his Aunt Carol shrieked. "That is your mother sitting right there." Marcus just ignored them, his attention focused solely on comforting the new, and infinitely more profitable, mother in his life. Isabel was looking up at him through her fake tears, her face a mask of grateful tragic love. They were a perfect, disgusting, and deeply triumphant pair. And through it all, I did not move. I did not speak. I simply sat in my armchair, a small, still island of calm in the midst of this raging emotional hurricane. The pain of my son's betrayal was a physical thing, a cold, sharp knife in my chest. But the 40 years I had spent as a historian, the lifetime I had spent as an observer of human folly, had given me a strange and in this moment, deeply useful sense of detachment. I was watching a scene from a play, a particularly ugly and predictable one, and I knew something that none of the other actors did. I knew there was a second act. Elias, my dear, loyal Elias, caught my eye from across the room. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. The noise in the room was reaching a crescendo. My sisters-in-law were now in a full-blown shouting match with Marcus. Elias, seeing his opening, stood up. "If I may have your attention," he said, his voice a calm, authoritative boom that immediately cut through the chaos. "If you would all please take your seats. The reading is not yet complete." A confused silence fell over the room. "Not complete?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp with annoyance. "It seems pretty damn complete to me. Isabel inherits. The end." "Not quite," Elias said, his voice a low, enigmatic purr. And then, I smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, quiet, and deeply, deeply unnerving thing. A small, slow, and utterly serene smile that did not touch my eyes. It was the smile of a woman who knows a secret. A terrible, beautiful, and deeply satisfying secret. The sight of my smile in the face of my own public humiliation seemed to unnerve them more than any tears or rage could have. The room fell completely, utterly silent. Every single eye was now on me, on the quiet, smiling, and suddenly very, very powerful widow. And then, with a slow, deliberate, and deeply theatrical grace, I reached into my handbag. I did not pull out a handkerchief. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out a second, identical and still perfectly sealed cream-colored envelope. I placed it on the polished surface of Elias's desk. The soft, papery sound was the only noise in the dead silent room. I just smiled, and pulled out the real will. The sight of the second envelope, identical to the first, lying on the desk had a profound and chilling effect on the room. The angry, chaotic energy of a moment before was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy, and deeply confused silence. Marcus and Isabel stared at the envelope as if it were a live scorpion. Their triumphant, unified front began to crack. A flicker of something uncertainty, fear appeared in their eyes for the first time. "What is that?" Marcus demanded, his voice a low, suspicious growl. I did not answer him. I looked at Elias, and with a small, almost imperceptible nod, I gave him his cue. "I believe," I said, my voice quiet, clear and full of a calm, serene power, "that you have the wrong document, Elias. This is my husband's final last will and testament, signed and notarized 1 month before his death." Elias, playing his part to perfection, looked at the first will, then at the new envelope, his face a mask of professional lawyerly confusion. "Well, this is highly irregular," he said, his voice a low murmur. He picked up the new envelope, examined the unbroken wax seal, and then looked at me. "Lena, are you certain?" "I am," I said. "Please, proceed." With a slow, deliberate gravity, Elias took his silver letter opener and slit open the second envelope. He pulled out the new set of documents. He put on his reading glasses. He cleared his throat, and then he read the first single and absolutely devastating line aloud. His voice was a clear, ringing, and deeply satisfying bell of judgment. "The will you have just heard," he read, "was a test. A final posthumous test of character for my son Marcus." The gasp that went through the room was a single, collective, and deeply shocked sound. Marcus staggered back as if he had been physically struck. His face, which had been so full of a smug, triumphant confidence, was now a pale, ashen mask of pure, dawning horror. Isabel's beautiful, tragic face had gone completely, utterly blank. The brilliant actress had just forgotten all her lines. She just stared at the new will in Elias's hand, her mind clearly racing, trying to process this new, impossible and catastrophic turn of events. A test, my sister-in-law Carol whispered, her voice full of a shocked righteous awe. It seems, Elias said, looking up over the rim of his glasses, his gaze fixed on my son, that your father had some concerns about your loyalty and about your judgment. He wanted to see in the event of his death where your allegiances would truly lie, with your mother or with your inheritance. He let the damning statement hang in the air. And you, Marcus, he continued, his voice a low, sorrowful and deeply disappointed thing, have just provided him with his answer. The room was silent. There was no shouting now, no bickering, just the profound, heavy and deeply uncomfortable silence of a man who has just had the full, ugly, and unforgivable truth of his own character laid bare for the entire world to see. He had been weighed, he had been measured, and he had been found profoundly, catastrophically and irrevocably wanting. The second will was not just a reversal of the first. It was a complete and total rewriting of the narrative of my husband's life. And of mine. It was his final and most eloquent apology to me, and his most damning indictment of his own foolishness. Elias, his voice now imbued with a new quiet authority, began to read. To my son Marcus, he read, I leave my deepest and most profound disappointment, but also a father's enduring if tested love, and a final chance to become the man I always hoped he would be. He then moved on to the disposition of the estate. The real disposition. I hereby declare, he read, his voice ringing with the clear, unambiguous language of the law, that my beloved wife Lena Harrison is the sole and absolute heir to my entire estate. She is the executor of this will, and she is to be given complete and total control over all assets real and personal of the Harrison Development Group. The words were a bomb, detonating in the silent, stunned room. Isabel let out a small, strangled sound, a whimper of pure animal despair. Her victory, which had seemed so total just moments before, had just been vaporized. But the will did not stop there. Franklin, in his final lucid moments, had decided to set the record straight, once and for all. I wish to state for the permanent and public record, Elias continued, his voice thick with a new, emotional weight, that the success of the Harrison Development Group was not mine alone. It was a partnership. My wife Lena, with her brilliant historical and strategic mind, was the co-founder and the silent strategic architect of everything we built together. Her contributions were not just foundational, they were essential. The empire was ours, not mine, and it is to her, its rightful co-creator, that I now return it in its entirety. Tears, real hot and unexpected, welled in my eyes. I had not expected that. I had not known he had put that in the will. To have my contribution, my life's work, so publicly and so lovingly acknowledged by him, after so many years of being dismissed and diminished, it was a gift more precious than any fortune. It was a restoration, a final, beautiful and deeply healing act of love. The room was silent, the guests now looking at me with a new, profound and deeply satisfying respect. I was no longer the pitiful, cast-aside widow. I was the queen, restored to her rightful throne. And then Elias turned to the final pages of the will. The pages that would deal with the fates of the two people who had so willingly and so eagerly tried to usurp that throne. All eyes in the room now turned to Isabel. She was no longer the triumphant, grieving heiress. She was a defendant in the dock, awaiting her sentence. Her beautiful face was a pale, tight mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The billion-dollar empire she had had in her grasp for a fleeting, glorious 10 minutes had just been snatched away. She was now at the mercy of the very will, and the very woman she had so arrogantly underestimated. Elias cleared his throat and read the clause that pertained to her. Franklin had, with a lawyer's precision and a scorned man's quiet fury, crafted a masterpiece of legal and personal revenge. To Miss Isabel Rousseau, Elias read, his voice a cold, dispassionate instrument of the law, for her years of service, to me and to my company I bequeath a single, one-time and final payment. He paused and the entire room leaned in, desperate to hear the number. Would it be 1,000,000? 100,000? A token gesture of a once great affection? The amount of this payment, Elias continued, has been calculated based on a detailed and comprehensive review of my personal financial records for the past 5 years. My accountants have determined the exact, total monetary value of all gifts, stipends, and expenses I have bestowed upon Miss Rousseau during the course of our association. This includes the lease on her apartment, the price of her car, all jewelry, clothing and travel expenses and a generous per diem for her time. A wave of shocked, scandalized murmuring went through the room. This was not a bequest. This was an itemized invoice. A public and deeply humiliating accounting of her time as a kept woman. Isabel's face, which had been pale, now flushed a deep, ugly, blotchy red. The shame of it was a physical thing, a visible wave of heat and humiliation. Elias was not finished. He picked up a second, smaller document from his desk. The full notarized accounting is attached here as an addendum to the will, he said, his voice utterly merciless, but for the record, the final calculated sum is $287,452.17. He looked directly at Isabel, his eyes cold and hard as stones. The will states, and I quote, "Consider us even. You have been more than adequately compensated for your time. This is not an inheritance, it is a severance package. The association is hereby terminated." The finality of it, the sheer brutal and deeply corporate coldness of it, was absolute. She had not been a lover, she had not been a partner, she had been a service provider, and her contract had just been, in the most public and humiliating way imaginable, terminated. She looked at me, her eyes full of a new, desperate and deeply pleading hope. Perhaps she thought I would be merciful, that I, a fellow woman, would intervene. I just looked back at her, my expression serene, my eyes giving her nothing. This was not my doing. This was the will of the man she had claimed to love, and he had just from beyond the grave reduced their entire 5-year great love to a simple and rather tawdry financial transaction. With Isabel's fate sealed, a quiet, brutal, and deeply satisfying piece of legal theater, all eyes in the room now turned to the last remaining defendant. My son. Marcus was no longer the proud, confident man who had strode into this office an hour ago. He was a broken, hollowed-out thing, a ghost at the funeral of his own life. He had publicly betrayed his mother. He had been exposed as a fool. And he had just witnessed the woman he had chosen over his own family be reduced to a tawdry, itemized expense. He was now at long last completely and utterly alone, awaiting his own judgment. He seemed to have shrunk in his chair, his expensive suit now looking too big for him. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new dawning and truly pathetic terror. He had just seen the cold, ruthless precision with which his father had dealt with his mistress. What, he must have been wondering, did his father have in store for the son who had so eagerly and so willingly sided with her? Elias, with a grim, almost sorrowful air, turned to the final section of the will, the section that would determine the fate of Marcus Harrison. "And now," Elias said, his voice a low, somber thing, "to my only son Marcus." He began to read, and the words that followed were not a simple disinheritance. That would have been too easy, too clean. No. Franklin, in his final complex and deeply wounded act as a father, had devised something far more intricate, something far more educational. "My son, Marcus, is not to be disinherited," Elias read, and a small, almost imperceptible flicker of hope appeared in Marcus's terrified eyes. "He is my blood, and he will, one day, inherit a portion of the empire his mother and I built, but he is not yet the man he needs to be to deserve that inheritance. He has shown a profound lack of judgment, a deep and troubling weakness of character, and a stunning deficit of loyalty. These are not the qualities of a leader, these are the qualities of a follower, and so, before he can ever hope to lead, he must first learn to follow." The hope in Marcus's eyes died, replaced by a new cold dread. "Therefore," Elias continued, his voice the relentless, unforgiving instrument of my husband's will, "I hereby strip my son Marcus Harrison of his title and all responsibilities as vice president of the Harrison Development Group. Effective immediately, his current salary and all corporate perks are hereby terminated." Marcus flinched as if he had been physically struck. His title, his position, the very core of his professional identity, had just been vaporized. "His inheritance," Elias read on, "will be held in trust, under the sole and absolute administration of his mother Lena Harrison. To become eligible to receive that inheritance, he must first meet the following, non-negotiable condition. He must accept a new position within the company, a position of his mother's choosing. For a period of no less than 2 years, he will serve as his mother's executive assistant, at a salary to be determined by her, and with no authority other than that which she chooses to grant him. He will learn the business from the ground up. He will learn it from the perspective of a subordinate. He will learn it finally from her, the woman he so foolishly and so profoundly underestimated. The sentence was not one of financial ruin. It was one of profound and deeply public humiliation. He was not being cast out. He was being put on a leash. A very short, very tight, and very, very strong leash. And the hand holding that leash, for the next 2 years, would be mine. The terms of my son's new reality settled over the room. A sentence of such profound and poetic justice that it was almost a work of art. He was not being sent to a prison of iron bars, but to a far more effective one, a prison of his own shattered pride. For 2 years he would have to be my shadow, my subordinate, the yes man to the very woman he had tried to depose. He would have to answer my calls, fetch my coffee and sit in on meetings where his only role would be to take the minutes. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a final brilliant lesson from his father on the true nature of power. Marcus just sat there, his face a pale greenish white. He was a man who had just been publicly stripped of his title, his authority, his very identity, and he had been handed a new one, his mother's assistant. The humiliation of it was a palpable, suffocating thing. Isabel, who had been a frozen statue of shock, finally seemed to come to her senses. She looked at Marcus, at this broken, powerless man, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. He was no longer a prince, the heir to an empire. He was a glorified secretary, a liability. She stood up, her beautiful face a mask of cold reptilian fury. "Well," she said, her voice a low, vicious hiss that was for him alone. "It seems you are not the man I thought you were, after all." And with that she turned and stormed out of the office, her high heels clicking a sharp, angry rhythm on the polished floor, the sound of a bad investment being written off. Marcus was now at last truly and completely alone. He looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate pleading hope. A hope that I would be the soft, forgiving mother he had always known. A hope that I would tell him it was all a terrible joke, that I would not enforce this cruel and unusual punishment. But the woman looking back at him was not that mother. That mother was gone. The woman looking back at him was the new and sole CEO of the Harrison Development Group. And she was all business. "It's a choice, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet, calm and utterly non-negotiable. "You can accept the terms, or you can refuse." "And if I refuse," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. Elias, without being asked, cleared his throat and read the final terrible clause of my husband's will. "In the event," he read, "that my son Marcus Harrison refuses to accept the position offered to him under the terms of this will, or in the event that he fails to complete the full 2-year period of employment to the complete satisfaction of his mother, then his portion of the inheritance shall be considered forfeit. The entirety of his share of the Harrison Legacy Trust will be immediately and irrevocably liquidated and donated, in its entirety, to the Savannah Historical Preservation Society. The final, beautiful, and deeply satisfying checkmate. The charity I had championed for 30 years. The one he and his father had always dismissed as my little historical society. The choice was his. He could choose his pride. He could refuse to be humbled, refuse to submit to my authority. And in doing so he would walk away with nothing. A 42-year-old man with no job, no prospects, and a reputation that was about to be in tatters. Or he could choose the money. He could swallow his pride, endure 2 years of what he would consider to be a living hell, and in the end he would be a very, very rich man. I had him. My husband, in his final brilliant act, had given me him. He had placed my son's future, his very soul, into my hands. And now I would have 2 years to see if there was anything left in that soul that was worth saving. The explosion that followed Isabel's dramatic exit was a quiet internal one. Marcus did not rage. He did not protest. He simply collapsed. He sat in that leather armchair in the silent wood-paneled office, and he seemed to shrink, the air going out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell of a man. The weight of his own betrayal, the sheer catastrophic miscalculation he had made, had finally completely and utterly crushed him. My 2 sisters-in-law, who had been silent, stunned witnesses to this entire brutal drama, finally found their voices. They came over to me, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a new profound respect. They hugged me, they whispered words of comfort and solidarity. They had never particularly liked Isabel, and they had always felt Marcus was a weak, entitled man. They were, in their own quiet way, deeply satisfied with this outcome. Elias, with a quiet, professional efficiency, escorted them out, promising to be in touch regarding the smaller bequests. And then he returned to the office, leaving me alone with my son. We sat in the silence for a long, long time. I did not speak. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. This was his reckoning, his Gethsemane, and he had to face it alone. Finally, he lifted his head, His face was a mess of tears and a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. I'll be your assistant." It was not a choice made out of a desire for redemption. It was a choice made out of a desperate, pragmatic greed. He had chosen the money over his pride. It was, in its own sad way, the most honest decision he had made all day. "Good," I said, my voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Your new position begins on Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." And with that I stood up and walked out of the office, leaving him sitting there, alone, in the ruins of his life. The fallout in the days that followed was, as I had expected, swift and merciless. The news of the dramatic will reading, with its shocking reversal of fortune, spread through the tight-knit world of Savannah society like a wildfire. The story was too delicious, too full of drama and intrigue to be contained. Isabelle Rousseau, the woman who had been for a fleeting moment the queen of the city, became a social pariah overnight. She was a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. Her friends abandoned her. Her credit was cut off. She was forced to move out of the lavish Franklin-funded apartment. She vanished from the Savannah social scene as quickly and as completely as if she had never existed. Marcus's fall was quieter but no less profound. He was forced to resign from the boards of the two charities he sat on. He had to give up his membership at the country club. He sold his expensive sports car. His entire carefully curated life of privilege and status was systematically dismantled, piece by methodical piece. He was a prince who had been publicly and very effectively turned back into a pauper. And on Monday morning his new life, his sentence, was about to begin. Monday morning arrived, bright and clear. I walked into the headquarters of the Harrison Development Group, not as a visitor, not as the founder's quiet, academic wife, but as the sole, absolute, and undisputed power. The office was a monument to Franklin's ego. It was a vast corner suite on the top floor of the building we owned, with a panoramic view of the Savannah River. The walls were covered in framed magazine articles about him, pictures of him with politicians and celebrities. The furniture was heavy, masculine, and deeply ostentatious. It was the office of a king, and it was now mine. My first order of business was a full and complete exorcism. I had a team of movers come in and strip the office bare. The heavy mahogany desk was donated to a charity auction. The self-aggrandizing photographs were taken down and put into storage. The thick, oppressive carpets were ripped up, revealing the beautiful original heartpine floors beneath. I spent the next week redesigning the space. I had the walls painted a warm, serene cream. I brought in my own furniture from home, a simple, elegant antique desk, comfortable armchairs, and my own beloved collection of historical maps of the Georgia coastline. I replaced the monument to a man's ego with a quiet, functional, and deeply personal space. A space where a woman could think, a space where a woman could work. And I worked. I delved into the company's financials, into the current projects, with a fierce, focused energy I hadn't felt in years. And I discovered that, as I had long suspected, Franklin in his later years had become complacent. He had been so focused on the big, flashy legacy-building projects that he had neglected the smaller, more profitable, foundational work that had built our empire in the first place. I immediately began to make changes. I cancelled the over-leveraged high-rise project he had been so proud of, the one Marcus had so eagerly championed. I put a stop to the company's extravagant spending on client entertainment, and I initiated a new program, a quiet, strategic acquisition of small, undervalued historic properties in the city's less fashionable neighborhoods. The very kind of work that had been my specialty, my passion, the work he had dismissed as my little hobby. The company, under my new, quiet and deeply analytical leadership, began to breathe again. The old bloated and slightly rotten empire was being trimmed, pruned, and brought back to a state of lean, efficient, and deeply profitable health. The employees, who had been terrified of the charismatic but unpredictable Franklin, and had despised the arrogant and incompetent Marcus, responded to my new regime with a quiet, profound relief. They saw a leader who was calm, who was logical, who listened, and who, most importantly, knew the business inside and out. I was not just the widow, I was the boss, and it was a role that fit me like a glove. The power I had always held, the silent, strategic power that had been the true engine of our success, was no longer silent, and it was a formidable thing to behold. I had reclaimed my company, I had reclaimed my life, and now it was time for the first day of my new executive assistant. At precisely 9 a.m. the following Monday there was a soft, hesitant knock on my new office door. "Come in," I said, my voice calm and even. I did not look up from the financial report I was reviewing. The door opened, and he entered. My son. He was not the man who had walked into Elias's office a week ago. The expensive tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple conservative and slightly ill-fitting one that he had probably had to buy off the rack. The arrogant confident swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet shuffling and deeply humbled uncertainty. His face was pale, his eyes were downcast. He stood in the middle of my bright, airy office, looking lost and out of place. He looked at the historical maps on the walls, at the simple, elegant furniture, at me sitting behind the desk that was not his father's, and he must have felt like he had walked into a foreign country, which, in a way, he had. He had walked into my country, and he was here on a work visa. Good morning, Marcus, I said, finally looking up. I did not smile. My voice was not warm. It was the polite, neutral, and professional voice of a CEO addressing a new junior employee. Good morning, ma'am, he said, the word ma'am, a clumsy, unfamiliar, and deeply humiliating thing on his tongue. He had never in his entire life had to show me that kind of formal deference. Please, have a seat, I said, gesturing to the small, simple chair opposite my desk. Not the plush leather armchair for a favored guest, but the hard, functional chair for a subordinate. He sat. He placed a small, cheap notepad and a pen on the desk. He looked at me, his eyes full of a miserable, expectant dread. I let the silence sit for a moment, a quiet reminder of the new power dynamic between us. Welcome to your first day at the Harrison Development Group, I began, my voice a calm, professional monotone. Your title is Executive Assistant to the CEO. Your duties for the foreseeable future will be as follows. You will be responsible for managing my calendar, for taking the minutes at all executive meetings, for preparing my coffee, and for handling any and all administrative tasks I see fit to assign to you. Your salary will be $40,000 a year, with no benefits for the first 90 days. Do you have any questions? He just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the surface of my desk. $40,000. He had probably spent that much on watches last year. Good, I said. Then your first task is this. I pushed a thick, heavy, and deeply dusty ledger book across the desk towards him. It was one of the original accounting ledgers from my first business, the one I had run out of our kitchen long before Franklin. This is a record of every single transaction from the first 5 years of this company's existence, I explained. I want you to transfer all of this data into a new digital spreadsheet. I want every invoice, every receipt, every single penny accounted for. I want to see the profit and loss for every single project. I want you to understand, in the most granular, tedious, and mind-numbing detail, exactly what it took to build the foundation of the company you were so eager to command. He looked at the dusty old book, at the pages and pages of my own, neat, handwritten script. It was a task that would take him weeks. It was a piece of pure, unadulterated drudgery. It was his penance. He just nodded, his face a mask of miserable, resigned acceptance. He reached for the ledger. And Marcus, I said, my voice stopping him. He looked up, his eyes finally meeting mine. Yes, ma'am. My coffee, I said, my voice a quiet, simple, and utterly unshakable command. Black. 2 sugars. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, and in his eyes I saw it all. The humiliation, the rage, the despair. But also, for the first time, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something else, something new, the dawning, terrifying, and deeply necessary understanding of a man who has finally, at the age of 42, just been given his very first job. He stood up, picked up my empty coffee cup from the desk, and walked out of my office to begin his new life. The road ahead of him was long, and I did not know if he would make it. But for the first time he was on a path that was real, and that I thought was a foundation upon which something perhaps could be built.